Go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our first presenter, Barbara Pennington, who will be presenting our What Clinical Research Means to You presentation. Without further ado, Barbara, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kayla. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. You might have seen us on the map a month ago when we were the target on the Weather Channel for some hurricane action, but we are back and bracing for the next tropical storm here. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. We hosted an event for CISCRP, which I always like to say what an acronym is before I launch right in, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. So here at UNC Wilmington, we hosted an event where we invited several research naive people in our community, people who wanted to know a little bit more about clinical research, as well as people who are in our community who work in the clinical research world, and medical people and people who are study coordinators, and it was very, very successful. The other group of people who came were our students. We have a bachelor's degree in clinical research here at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and so we've got juniors and seniors who are specializing in clinical research, and they really enjoyed being able to meet people and talk about clinical research and learn a little bit more about how clinical research happens in our community. So I'm delighted that the folks at CISCRP invited me back to do this presentation, and it looks like our Cisco meeting, well, I'm not in charge of that. So now we'll just move forward with the slides. What clinical research means to you. And the first slide that we have after this is clinical research volunteers are medical heroes. And we're going to talk a little bit about why we refer to clinical research volunteers as the heroes in medicine that are kind of unsung. If we didn't have volunteers to participate in clinical trials, then we wouldn't be able to have studies to test new medications and products for use among the general public. So, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what is a clinical trial, but clinical trials are sponsored primarily, in this country especially, by the United States government. The National Institutes for Health is a huge sponsor of clinical trials. In addition to academic medical centers like ours or University of North Carolina, or many, many medical centers that are both have medical colleges, and then also just, it could be a psychology department, whatever, at an academic institution. Pharmaceutical companies, of course, like a big Johnson & Johnson or a Merck, or small biotech companies that are just working on one or two specific drugs or compounds to treat maybe one specific area, like breast cancer or something. And then, of course, there's medical device companies that test things like a pacemaker or a new prosthetic device for amputees or things like that. So medical device companies, those are also sponsors. So what is clinical research? Most people don't necessarily understand what clinical research is all about. And in fact, for our students, we always say, you know, just because they decided that they were going to have a major in clinical research doesn't necessarily mean they understand all about it. So our goal is that by the time they get home for Thanksgiving and are sitting around the table and their uncle or aunt asks them, what's your major? And they say clinical research, and then the family member says, well, what is that? They can give them a 30-second presentation about here's what clinical research is. And because there's a lot of fear and unknown about clinical research. People are afraid they might be treated like guinea pigs, or they hear horror stories back from the past, like things like the Tuskegee syphilis study or the Nuremberg trials, and they think, well, doctors are trying to just kind of trick people into these trials. And that is absolutely not the case. So at the center, CISCRP, they really are just more focused on educating people about what clinical trials, what clinical research is, especially before people decide to participate in clinical trials. So the more you understand what a clinical trial and what clinical research is, the more likely people are to actually participate in a clinical trial. So the next slide talks about, well, what do we learn from a clinical trial and from clinical research? Well, there are many, many things that we learn. One of the things I like to tell my students is, you know, you learn a lot about what doesn't work as much, if not more, than what really does work. You know, when you're trying a trial of anything, you find out, well, this doesn't work, so we won't do that again. But what we like to focus on in a clinical study is if it's a new drug, does it work better than the ones that are already out there on the market? Of course, that is absolutely the case for things like diabetes and cancer research and cystic fibrosis, where you've seen just monumental gains over the past 10 and 20 years over what has been previously approved. And the way that we get that information is through clinical research. And then the other things that we're learning about, especially lately, is how do your genetics impact a drug or a product? And then does where you live have anything to do with whether or not a drug will work? Like if you're in a higher altitude, will that impact the accessibility of a drug to you? And not just in terms of can you purchase a particular drug, but how does that impact of a higher elevation, higher altitude? What does that have to do with how the drug works in your body? So things like that, those are questions that we ask in a clinical trial. And so the next slide will say, well, what is a clinical trial? And I think a lot of people are moving toward referring to these as clinical studies. So it is a scientific study and rigorous. Our FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, really requires a lot of rigor to go into development of a clinical trial protocol that is sort of like the map, the roadmap for how to do a study. So it's a very carefully designed study, and researchers rely on volunteers to take a new drug once it's been tested in the lab to make sure they can answer the specific medical question. And one of the questions, in fact, I tell my students that we always can come back to these two questions. Is the drug safe, and is it effective? So you can take a placebo or something that really doesn't have any medicinal value whatsoever, and it might be very safe, but why take it if it's not going to be effective? So these are the questions that we have to rely on volunteers in a clinical trial to help us answer. And one of the other questions, in addition to is it safe, is what kind of side effects does it have? Because there are always going to be some kind of side effects, some worse or not as worse as others. And then what's the appropriate dose? And if you're giving the drug to children, do you just maybe cut the dose in half? Or how would you know how this drug might impact children unless you're able to test it that way? So because of the fact that we don't have answers to these questions, we rely on participants to volunteer for clinical trials so that we can learn the answer to these questions and more about a new drug or a new product. In the next slide, we talk about the difference between the standard of care, what you would get when you just go to your doctor for a routine medical appointment, and what is a clinical trial. So being in a clinical trial is not the same as just going to your doctor for treatment of a particular ailment. Like you go to your doctor and you have an infection, and the doctor gives you an anti-infective agent, an antibiotic or something like that. And this is routine care. all right, or standard of care, something that is already approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So that drug that you will get you get a prescription for it from your doctor. That's standard of care or routine care. Now, if you have a particular case that there's no standard of care for, the doctor might say, we don't really have anything approved, but there might be a clinical trial that might be appropriate for you. And so that's where we get into the difference between that standard of care, what's already been approved, and a clinical trial, things that have they're going through the decision-making or the study process. All right, so the next slide, and I think this is, we're learning so much more about how different drugs impact different people based on so many, a variety of different factors. For instance, the way that females respond to a drug may be very different than the way that males respond to a drug, or people who are young may respond very, very differently than people who are elderly. And then, of course, there's ethnic background or your race or where you live. So, for instance, diabetes, type 2 diabetes especially, and asthma, that's more common in African Americans. And for people who develop osteoporosis, you're at a higher risk if you're female, Caucasian, Asian, and Hispanic. So it's things like that that are really, I think, fascinating, and we're learning so much more about that in terms of genetic research. And that's why when we talk about volunteers in clinical trials, we need a variety of different people, ages, races, genders, et cetera. The next slide is going to talk about the different phases of clinical research. So the FDA in this country, and actually this is the case in all developed countries, because we do have standards that are called from the International Conference on Harmonization that sort of standardize the regulations for clinical trials throughout the world, really. So the U.S. And Europe have, and actually Japan initially, united on these. And so there are some international rules. And so this 4-phase process is really not just the standard in our country, but also globally as well. So during phase 1 studies, this is what we call first in humans. So there's a smaller number of volunteers, and often these are healthy volunteers, so you don't have a variety of different medical ailments in a phase 1 study. And so typically what you're studying here is what's a safe dose, how does it work in the body, and is the drug harmful? And if you have that small number of volunteers and the drug is relatively low impact and deemed safe, then we move on to phase 2 studies, and we want to see how the drug actually works in this. Is it safe for patients who have a specific disease or a condition? So again, safety is the main goal, but in phase 2 studies, we look for questions to answers such as, well, how much of the drug, what's the dosage of this drug, how much should people take, and what are the typical side effects that we're going to see with this drug. And if that's successful, and you should know that only about 1/3 of the drugs that go through the phase 2 testing actually make it in to phase 3 of clinical trials. And it's a much larger group of people that are tested in a phase 3 clinical trial. This stage really provides a whole lot more information because often there are thousands and thousands of people who are required to participate in a phase 3 trial. And so at this stage, you're really checking not only the drug's safety in a larger group of people, but how well it works in a variety of different people. So you've got a variety of genders, ages, and ethnicity and things like that, and then also region of the country and globally. So these are the much larger trials. And sometimes in phase 3, the drug may be tested against an already approved drug. So this is a more accurate comparison, like, all right, this is what's already out there on the market, but here is our test product, the new drug, and we want to see if it actually is better than what's already out there and available for people. In phase 4, if it's required, sometimes the drugs, if it's already approved by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, then sometimes they recommend, FDA recommends getting a much, much larger sampling or a more diverse sampling in different populations. So at phase 4 studies, you really look at how is this drug used in the general population with physicians who are prescribing it in a much larger scale. And also a longer period of time. So in a phase 3 study, it's it's time limited. It might last a year or 2 years or even 3 or 5 years. But we want to, in phase 4 studies, we test even longer periods of time than that. So the whole process really takes a long time, could be 10 to 15 years sometimes. The next slide talks about the people, and I've mentioned this already, the people who sponsor these clinical trials, because you can imagine it takes so long and it involves so many different people, not only the healthcare professionals but also the volunteers. And so you've got a lot of money and a lot of people who have to be involved in coordinating and sponsoring the clinical trial. In this country, the U.S. government is the largest sponsor of clinical trials, and they are actually the largest sponsor of clinical trials globally as well. Academic medical centers, pharmaceutical companies for sure, and then the smaller biotech companies that really have maybe a smaller focus on one therapeutic area or 1 or 2 drugs, and then of course device companies. Now, CISCRP doesn't sponsor any particular studies. What they focus on is educating people about clinical trials and making educated decisions, informed decisions about whether or not to participate in a clinical trial. So next we're going to look at the clinical research team and what's referred to as the informed consent process. So, as in many projects, most projects really, it requires a team who do a lot of different things on a clinical trial. And at CISCRP, they use this analogy with a sports team. We'll walk through all of these different, the different members of the research team. Nobody has a lesser or a greater role. Each person in the research team, including the research participant, has a significant and very crucial role to play. So the first role is, or the first one we'll focus on, is the principal investigator. So they liken him to the head coach. This is a person who is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the study at their research site. And so they have to study the rules of the study, which are referred to as the protocol. That's the roadmap or the rule book for each particular study. And the PI is also responsible for directing the study team. So they follow the protocol and they direct the study team to, with all the instructions based on what's stated in the protocol, how to do the study from start to finish, and coordinating all the efforts from lab people to the participants to the study coordinators and everything in between. The next slide talks about the research coordinator, and this is such a critical role. Really, they're sometimes referred to as the certified research coordinator or the clinical research coordinator, and they handle all the day-to-day activities. They work in conjunction with the principal investigator, but they typically, the clinical research coordinator, or sometimes referred to as the study coordinator, they're often the main contact for study volunteers. So often, if the principal investigator is not necessarily available, the study coordinator is really a terrific contact for the volunteers to answer all questions about the study and your participation in the study. Now, the next one, and this is really the focus of CISCRP, is study volunteers and making sure that you know that you are protected. So there are all kinds of protections in place for study volunteers. So like the referees, there are rules in place that the referees of a clinical trial will make sure that the study team, the PI, and everybody participating follows the rules. So the referees, they know the rules before the study starts. They approve of the study, and then at the end of the study, they look at all the data to make sure that everything has been done to protect study participants. So the next slide, we'll talk about this one particular group, and that is the Institutional Review Boards, or IRBs. And IRBs are really responsible for making sure that studies are done ethically and in protecting human subjects or human research participants, and that there's not too much risk at any point in time for those study volunteers. Now, FDA, the next slide talks about FDA, and so in this country, FDA is also involved in protecting human research participants. And because they have to be aware of everything having to do with the study from the beginning all the way to the end. The next slide talks about the volunteers. Very, very important. We couldn't do research studies without volunteers. Research just simply cannot happen. So we need healthy volunteers for phase 1 studies, and then of course volunteers at every point along the way through phase 4 studies to participate in the clinical trial process. Then we talk about the other supporters like your family, friends and family of supporters, which is the next slide. And we talk about how important these people are because you need support. If you're going to participate in a clinical trial, you might ask your friends and family first, and your friends and family might say, well, here's what we know, but they also might encourage you to contact the research coordinator or the PI on the study. So when you decide to participate in a clinical trial, we definitely want to encourage you to talk with friends and family and engage them in the process because they are as much a part of the clinical team as you are to some extent because of the fact that they will be your support. Now, how do you decide if you're eligible? How would anyone know if you are eligible to participate in a clinical trial? Well, in that rule book or the protocol, it has a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And in that inclusion criteria, it describes who should be enrolled in a clinical trial. And the exclusion criteria, likewise, describes who should not be allowed to participate in that clinical trial. And so that's referred to as eligibility criteria. So you have to be really, really honest with researchers about your disease state, any medications that you might be on, your whole medical history, in order to make sure that the eligibility criteria is well examined before allowing you to participate in a clinical trial. The next thing that clinical researchers will make sure to go over with you is in the informed consent process. And I always refer to informed consent as a process because, as pointed out here, really the process starts with a conversation between you as a participant and the study staff. Now, of course, there's going to be a form to sign, and often that form is lengthy and complex. But the most important thing for you to do is know the information on that form, the informed consent form. And if you have questions, then that's what that process is all about, making sure that you ask whatever questions you have before you sign the form and agree to participate. And that's the whole conversation, the back and forth. And one of the things, the next slide talks about not only your rights and your protections as a research participant, but also your obligation. You have a responsibility. If you agree to participate in a clinical trial, then you have a responsibility to uphold your end of the clinical trial. If you agreed to participate and show up for your study visits, and if there are 10 study visits and you have to show up between a certain window of time, then you agree that you will do that. And so not only should you have some benefits of participating in a clinical trial, but there may be some risks from participating in a clinical trial. There might be side effects of a drug. You might incur some costs, parking at a medical facility, for instance, and things like that. But there may be some reimbursement for you. So those are the kinds of things that you ask questions about during the informed consent process, and then of course you make sure that all of your questions are answered and that you can legitimately say yes if you decide to, if you agree to participate because you can meet the requirements of that particular study. You should also know that if at any point along the way you decide this study is not right for you, either you can't meet the obligations or you're having side effects that are intolerable, then you can stop at any time, and you have that right. And the only thing the study staff is going to ask is that you let them know if you need to quit and why you need to quit. But just know that that is absolutely within your right, and if you choose. And the study staff is committed to making sure that you do this safely and as thoroughly as possible. So really then the next question comes down to, is it right for me to participate in a clinical trial? We've talked about the different phases and the protections and the study team, but now the decision really is, based on my rights as a research participant and my responsibilities, the question comes down to, should I participate or not? And deciding to participate in a clinical trial is really a personal decision that you should discuss not only with the study doctor and the study team, but also with your family or friends and your support team. So you really need to evaluate the risks and the benefits and ask those questions before starting. You can understand the study design. We won't go through this because I know I'm probably at the end of my time here, but you may be randomized into a clinical trial, and that means it's like a flipping of a coin of, are you going to get study drug or would you get placebo? If you're in a blinded clinical trial, it means that you may not know the identity of the actual treatment. It might just be study drug. And then you should know that you might have the option, or you might be randomized into the phase of the trial that is that receives a placebo or something that really will have no effect whatsoever. The other thing that you really need to be aware of is not only the physical risks that might be involved, and this is on the next slide, and I like the fact that they say there are emotional risks as well. And so the possible risks might be that it's difficult for you to answer some of the questions if they ask quality of life kinds of questions, and you might feel like they're asking very, very personal or private information. Of course, a study team is going to keep your information confidential, but it might be a little bit uncomfortable for you. And again, you are giving permission to the researchers to collect data about you, and you're agreeing to follow the rules. So just know that not only should you contemplate the risk, but the benefits as well. So some things for you to consider on the next slide are, what's going to be the commitment for you? How much time is it going to be? Do you know that the trial could end at any time, not just because you decide to quit, but because the study might stop unexpectedly? And, you know, you might decide to participate in a clinical trial, but you might not necessarily get any benefit whatsoever. So you might not feel better as a result of participating in this clinical trial. So you just need to know that if you want to continue and participate, all the people who are involved, your doctor, the study coordinator, or the clinical research coordinator, make sure that you ask these questions prior to signing the consent form. Again, at CISCRP, they are most concerned that you feel like you have had education before you decide to participate. We encourage you because a lot of people drop out of studies because they didn't fully understand what they were signing up for. So we want to make sure that you're going to do your homework. You learn about the trial, you ask questions, you read the information, you go online and study as much as you can about the study. Take your time. There's nothing wrong with asking questions and saying, I need to think about this, or I need to talk to my family. Ask the doctor or the coordinator to use simpler words if they're using big sort of medical terms and you just simply don't understand. So ask questions. Bring a family member or a friend when you're going through the consent process. You're allowed to do that. Or take notes to make sure that you can reflect back on it later. If you decide to join a study, you should feel confident that you have made an informed decision and that you know that the study staff is going to support you all along the way. So the next slide is going to talk about your decision at every step. We've talked about this a little bit already. Find out about the study, talk about it with your doctor and then the research staff, go through the informed consent slowly and deliberately, and then you agree to participate in the clinical trial, and then all the way to the end to where you complete. So this is a good little decision tree here. You might say, you know what, if the answer to these questions are no, then you're just going to continue with your usual standard of care or treatment. And the next slide, where should you go to learn more? Well, your doctor, of course. Hopefully today's presentation is a first step. Now you're going to learn a little bit more about clinical trials. And several years ago, the U.S. government set up clinicaltrials.gov, probably the best resource for you to learn as much about not only what clinical trials are, but the kinds of clinical trials that are being sponsored in this country especially. There are a few other websites listed there in addition to the CISCRP website.org. So if you don't have access to the internet, there is a phone number that I will repeat just real slowly in case some of you just need to write down a phone number instead of, if you don't have access to the internet and can't get to these. It is 617-725-2750. And you should know that CISCRP provides a free search service that's designed to help patients find trials that might be right for you. Or, again, you can talk to your doctor or the research site or friends or family or clinicaltrials.org. So, again, I'll repeat that number, 617-725-2750, if you just need to call rather than using the internet. So the last slide is just to thank you. Again, I want to just reemphasize that the study volunteers are really medical heroes, and without them, medical science just could not move forward. So I really thank you for taking the time to learn about clinical research, and I just encourage you to share what you've heard with friends and family. Go to those websites, and on behalf of CISCRP, and again, I'd like to thank CISCRP for inviting me to do this overview of participating in the clinical trial process, and I really just want to end with thanking all the millions and millions of people who have participated in clinical trials and advanced medical science in this country and in the world. So thank you.